In that bag. A 6-year-old girl whispered to the millionaire, and seconds later, he was calling 911. The lobby of the business center was filled with constant motion, yet Daniel Hayes felt oddly detached from it all. People passed by him in every direction, their footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor, their conversations blending into a low, indistinct hum. He stood near one of the tall columns, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket, his blue eyes flicking to his watch for the third time in less than a minute. He hated delays. They made him feel as if control, something he had spent his entire life building, was slipping through his fingers. Daniel had arrived early, as always. Years of discipline had taught him that being punctual was a sign of respect and power, and today was no exception. A crucial meeting awaited him upstairs, one that could decide the future of a major investment. His assistant, however, was late, stuck somewhere in the underground parking garage, sending apologetic messages that did nothing to ease Daniel's growing irritation. He took a slow breath and looked around the lobby, his gaze sharp and observant by habit. The place looked exactly as it should. Clean. Bright. Safe. Security guards stood near the entrances, cameras blinked quietly above, and the large glass doors slid open and closed with mechanical precision. It was the kind of environment designed to reassure people that nothing bad could ever happen here. Daniel believed that once, without question. A black sports bag rested near one of the columns not far from where he stood. He noticed it briefly, registered it as someone's forgotten gym bag or luggage, and dismissed it from his thoughts almost immediately. In a place like this, unattended items were common. People rushed. People forgot things. Nothing unusual. He shifted his weight and checked his phone again, scanning unread emails while his mind ran through figures and contracts. The world around him continued its rhythm, indifferent to his impatience. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed softly. Somewhere else, a phone rang. Life moved on, predictable and orderly. What Daniel did not notice was the small girl sitting on a bench a few meters away, her legs dangling above the floor, her blue eyes fixed not on a toy or a screen, but on two men standing close together near the cafe entrance. She was very still, far too still for a 6-year-old, her fingers clenched tightly in the fabric of her red t-shirt. Sophie listened. She didn't understand everything the men were saying, but she understood enough. The way their voices dropped. The way they glanced around. The way one of them nodded subtly toward the black bag before quickly looking away again. Sophie's heart began to beat faster, a strange, cold fear creeping into her chest without asking permission. Daniel, meanwhile, slipped his phone back into his pocket and straightened his shoulders. He glanced once more at his watch, unaware that in the same vast lobby where he stood thinking about profits and schedules, something far more dangerous had already begun to unfold. And even more unaware that the only person who truly noticed it was a little girl everyone else overlooked. Sophie sat perfectly still on the bench, her small back pressed straight against the cold metal, as if movement itself might draw attention she could not afford. Around her, the lobby continued to pulse with ordinary life, people coming and going, laughing, complaining, scrolling through their phones, completely unaware that something was wrong. To Sophie, the contrast felt unbearable. How could everything look so normal when her stomach was twisting itself into tight knots? The two men stood near the cafe entrance, close enough that she could hear them without trying. They weren't whispering, but their voices were low, controlled, the way adults spoke when they believed no one important was listening. Sophie's feet stopped swinging. Her hands tightened in her lap. "You said it?" one of them asked quietly. The other nodded. "Timer's running. We leave before anyone notices." Sophie didn't know what a timer was supposed to do, but she knew what the word meant. It meant waiting. It meant something was coming. Her eyes followed the man's glance, and that was when she saw the black sports bag again, resting beside the column as if it belonged there. As if it were harmless. Her chest began to feel tight. The sounds of the lobby grew louder in her ears, then strangely muffled, like she was underwater. She tried to tell herself she was imagining things, that adults talked about strange stuff all the time, that she had misunderstood. But her body refused to calm down. Fear settled deep inside her, heavy and certain. Sophie glanced toward the cafe, where her mother was working behind the counter, busy with customers, her back turned. Calling out would only get her scolded. Worse, it might make the men notice her. Sophie shrank slightly, her shoulders curling inward as if she could make herself invisible. The men began to walk away, blending easily into the crowd. One of them laughed about something unrelated, his voice light, normal, convincing. Sophie watched them go, panic rising fast now, because whatever they had planned was still here. Still waiting. Still close. Her eyes darted back to the bag. It hadn't moved. It looked exactly the same. That somehow made it more frightening. She slid off the bench slowly, her sneakers barely making a sound against the polished floor. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure someone must hear it. She took a step, then another, unsure of where she was going, only knowing she couldn't stay where she was. Every instinct screamed that time mattered. Sophie looked around for someone, anyone who looked like they might listen. Most people were rushing, distracted, important looking. Adults always looked important. But then she saw him. Daniel Hayes stood near another column, tall and confident in his dark suit, his posture calm and assured. Sophie didn't know his name, didn't know he was a millionaire, didn't know anything about his life. She only knew that he looked like someone people listened to. Someone who wouldn't laugh or brush her away. Someone who mattered. Her legs felt weak as she started toward him. Each step felt like wading through invisible resistance. What if she was wrong? What if he got angry? What if she got in trouble? Her throat tightened, fear pressing tears into her eyes, but she forced them back. Crying wouldn't help. As she walked, the words she had overheard echoed in her head again and again. Bag. Timer. Leave. Sophie reached the edge of the column and stopped for a moment, staring up at the man in front of her. He was checking his watch, clearly impatient, clearly busy. He didn't see her yet. Her hands trembled as she reached out. This was the moment when silence would be easier. This was also the moment when silence could cost lives. Sophie swallowed hard, gathered every ounce of courage her small body could hold, and tugged gently at the sleeve of his jacket. Daniel felt the light tug on his sleeve before he actually saw who had touched him. His first reaction was irritation, quick and automatic, the kind that came from years of being interrupted by people who wanted something from him. He turned sharply, ready to dismiss whoever it was with a polite but firm gesture, and stopped mid-motion when he saw a small blonde girl standing far too close to him. She was looking up at him with wide blue eyes, her face pale, her lips slightly parted as if she had already tried to speak and failed. For a brief second, Daniel simply stared, confused by the contrast between her size and the intensity of her expression. Children usually smiled when they approached adults. They asked for help, or directions, or sometimes money. This girl looked as if she were holding back a scream. Yes, he asked, softening his voice without quite understanding why. Where are your parents? Sophie opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. Her heart was racing so fast she thought it might burst. The lobby felt suddenly enormous, the ceiling too high, the air too thin. She glanced over Daniel's shoulder toward the column with the black bag, then back at his face, as if checking that he was really listening. In that bag. She finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the lobby. Daniel frowned slightly and followed her gaze. He saw the black sports bag again and felt a flicker of annoyance. "That?" he asked. "What about it?" Sophie shook her head hard, panic flashing across her face. They said it will explode." The word hit him like a slap. For a heartbeat, Daniel didn't react at all. His mind rejected the sentence outright, pushing it aside as nonsense, as imagination, as something children said when they misunderstood adult conversations. He almost smiled, almost reached out to reassure her that everything was fine. Almost. Then he looked at her eyes again. They were not playful. They were not dramatic. They were terrified. "Who said that?" he asked slowly, crouching down so he was at her level. He noticed that his pulse had begun to speed up, though he couldn't yet explain why. "Take a breath. Tell me." Sophie swallowed, her hands twisting together in front of her. "Two men," she said. "They were standing by the cafe. They talked about a timer. And they pointed at the bag. Then they left." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He scanned the lobby without moving his head, noting exits, security guards, the flow of people. Everything still looked normal. Too normal. That was what frightened him most. "Did they say when?" he asked quietly. Sophie nodded. "Soon," she replied. "They said 20 minutes. Daniel stood up slowly, careful not to alarm her or draw attention. His thoughts raced now, sharp and focused. If there was even a small chance that she was right, ignoring her would be unforgivable. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers steady despite the surge of adrenaline running through him. "Stay here," he said gently, then corrected himself immediately. "No. Stay with me." He dialed without hesitation. 911, he said the moment the call connected. "I'm in the lobby of the Crossway Business Center. A child just warned me about a possible explosive device in an unattended bag." "Yes. Yes, I understand. We'll follow your instructions." As he listened, his gaze never left the black sports bag. It looked exactly the same as it had minutes ago. Silent. Ordinary. Deadly, if Sophie was right. Sophie stood close to him now, her small hand gripping the edge of his jacket as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She only watched his face, searching for reassurance, for proof that she had done the right thing. Daniel covered the phone for a moment and looked down at her. "You did exactly what you should have done," he said quietly. "I need you to listen to me now, all right?" She nodded. In that moment, surrounded by people who still had no idea how close they were to disaster, Daniel understood something with startling clarity. If this child had stayed silent, none of them would be standing here much longer. And he would never forgive himself for doubting her for even a second. The operator's calm voice flowed steadily through Daniel's phone, cutting through the noise of the lobby with clear, deliberate instructions. He listened closely, repeating key details under his breath, his eyes never leaving the black bag near the column. It sat there unchanged, indifferent to the fear now spreading quietly through his body. Around them, people continued to move, laugh, complain about the elevator wait, completely unaware that every second mattered. Daniel lowered the phone slightly and glanced down at Sophie. She stood rigid at his side, her small fingers still gripping his jacket as if letting go would make everything fall apart. Her face was pale, but her eyes were alert, tracking every movement around them. "We're going to move slowly," he said in a low voice meant only for her. "No running. No shouting. Can you do that?" She nodded immediately. Daniel followed the operator's instructions and began to walk, guiding Sophie with one hand while holding the phone to his ear with the other. He angled his body so that he blocked her from the bag as much as possible, his instincts kicking in with surprising force. He had negotiated hostile takeovers and walked into rooms filled with people who wanted him to fail, but this was different. This wasn't a battle of strategy. This was raw, immediate danger. Security noticed his movement almost at once. One of the guards stepped forward, his expression questioning, but Daniel met his gaze and shook his head slightly, a subtle signal to stay calm. He spoke quietly, briefly, choosing his words with care. "Potential device," he murmured. "We need a controlled evacuation. Now." The guard's face changed instantly. Professional calm replaced casual boredom. He tapped his earpiece and began issuing instructions, his voice low but urgent. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted. Elevators were temporarily shut down. Doors were redirected. People were guided toward exits under the explanation of a technical issue. Some protested. Some laughed nervously. Most obeyed without question. Sophie watched it all, her mind struggling to keep up. She hadn't imagined things becoming so big, so fast. Her chest felt tight, and she fought the urge to cry, reminding herself that crying wouldn't help anyone. She had already spoken. That was the hardest part. As they moved farther from the bag, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle fully on his shoulders. He stayed on the phone, answering questions, describing the men Sophie had seen, their clothing, their direction of exit. Sophie filled in the gaps when he hesitated, her memory sharp and precise despite her fear. "They had suits," she said softly. "One had a gray tie. They walked that way." Daniel repeated every detail. Outside, the first sirens became faintly audible, distant but growing closer. The sound sent a shiver through Sophie's spine. It made everything real in a way nothing else had. They reached the edge of the lobby near the main exit, where cooler air drifted in each time the doors opened. Daniel crouched down again, bringing himself to Sophie's level, his voice gentle but firm. "You did something very brave," he said. "But I need you to stay right here with me until they tell us it's safe. Can you promise me that?" "I promise," she whispered. He stood just as the first police officers entered the building, followed quickly by bomb squad specialists carrying equipment that looked far too serious to be part of an ordinary day. The crowd outside had grown, people gathering behind barriers, phones raised, confusion turning into unease. Minutes stretched painfully long. Then a voice crackled over the radio. "Device confirmed." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, a rush of cold flooding through him. Sophie squeezed his hand without realizing it, her small fingers trembling now that there was nothing left to do but wait. When the bomb squad finally emerged again, carrying the secured bag, the tension broke all at once. Relief hit Daniel so hard he had to steady himself. People around them exhaled, some crying, some laughing shakily, some simply standing in stunned silence. Sophie looked up at him, searching his face. "Is it over?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "Because of you," he said. She didn't smile. She just leaned into him slightly, exhausted, overwhelmed, finally allowing herself to feel how close everything had come to ending very differently. The aftermath settled slowly, like dust after an explosion that never happened. Police tape cordoned off the building, flashing lights painted the street in red and blue, and clusters of people stood whispering to one another, replaying fragments of fear they had only just begun to understand. Daniel sat on the edge of a concrete planter outside the entrance, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly as if letting go might cause the world to tilt again. Sophie sat beside him, her feet not quite touching the ground, wrapped in a security guard's oversized jacket that smelled faintly of fabric cleaner and cold night air. Now that the danger had passed, the adrenaline that had carried her through began to drain away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Her shoulders sagged, and she leaned slightly toward Daniel without even realizing she was doing it. An officer approached, notebook in hand, his expression careful and measured. He spoke first to Daniel, asking him to repeat the sequence of events, his tone respectful but precise. Daniel answered calmly, recounting every detail, but each time he spoke about Sophie, he slowed down, choosing his words as if they mattered more than the rest. Then the officer crouched in front of Sophie. "Can you tell me what you heard?" he asked gently. Sophie hesitated, glancing at Daniel. He nodded encouragingly, offering a small, steady smile. She took a breath and spoke, her voice quiet but clear, describing the men, their words, the bag, the way her stomach had felt when she realized something was wrong. The officer listened closely, asking only a few questions, never interrupting. When she finished, he closed his notebook and nodded. "You did exactly the right thing," he said. "A lot of adults wouldn't have." Sophie looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. Her mother arrived moments later, having been pulled from the cafe during the evacuation and left terrified by the chaos. When she saw Sophie, safe but shaken, she rushed forward and pulled her into a tight embrace, tears finally spilling over. "I was so scared," her mother whispered, voice breaking. "Why didn't you come to me?" Sophie clung to her, guilt and relief mixing painfully in her chest. "I didn't have time," she said softly. "I was scared too." Daniel watched the reunion in silence, feeling something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Gratitude, certainly, but also a heavy sense of responsibility. This child had stepped into danger without hesitation, not because she was fearless, but because she understood that staying quiet would be worse. Later, as emergency vehicles began to leave and the crowd thinned, Daniel stood and approached Sophie and her mother. He knelt again, bringing himself to Sophie's level, his voice low and sincere. "You saved lives tonight," he said. "Including mine." Her mother looked at him in disbelief, then down at her daughter, as if seeing her for the first time. Daniel straightened and turned to the woman. "I don't know how to thank you properly," he continued. "But I'd like to make sure Sophie and you are taken care of. Not because of what happened tonight, but because you shouldn't have to carry this alone." The woman nodded slowly, still overwhelmed, unsure what to say. As they prepared to leave, Sophie looked back at the building one last time. The black bag was gone. The danger was gone. But the memory remained, sharp and vivid. She slipped her hand into her mother's and whispered, "I'm glad I said something." Daniel heard her, and in that moment, he knew that no boardroom victory, no financial success, would ever mean as much as those quiet, brave words spoken by a 6-year-old girl who chose not to look away. The days that followed felt strangely unreal, as if time itself had slowed down to give everyone a chance to breathe again. Daniel returned to his routine on the surface, attending meetings and answering emails, but something inside him had shifted permanently. The building where the incident occurred remained closed for investigation, and each morning he received detailed reports from security and law enforcement. The men Sophie had overheard were identified quickly, their plans traced back through phone records and surveillance footage, and the truth emerged piece by piece, grim and undeniable. Daniel read every report carefully, but what stayed with him most were not the technical details or the narrow escape, but the image of Sophie standing in front of him, small and terrified, yet determined enough to speak. He found himself replaying that moment late at night, wondering how many times he had walked past danger simply because it didn't announce itself loudly enough. Sophie, meanwhile, struggled in quieter ways. At school, she found it hard to concentrate, her thoughts drifting back to the sound of the men's voices and the way her heart had pounded when she tugged on Daniel's sleeve. She didn't tell her classmates what had happened. She didn't want questions or praise. She wanted things to feel normal again, but normal had changed shape. Her mother noticed the difference immediately. Sophie slept lightly now, waking at small noises, and sometimes asked to keep the hallway light on. Her mother held her close on those nights, reminding her gently that she was safe, that the bad thing was over, even if it still lived in memory. Daniel insisted on seeing them again, not for cameras or statements, but privately. When they met in a quiet office away from the chaos of the city, he thanked Sophie once more, this time without urgency or fear in his voice. He spoke to her as if she were someone whose opinion mattered, not a child to be patted on the head and dismissed. "You listen to your instincts," he said. "That's rare. And important." Sophie looked at him thoughtfully. "It didn't feel brave," she admitted. "It felt scary." Daniel nodded. "That's what bravery usually feels like." He arranged counseling support for Sophie and her mother, not because he thought something was wrong with them, but because he understood that surviving danger left invisible marks. He made sure they never felt alone in dealing with what had happened. It wasn't charity. It was responsibility. As weeks passed, Sophie slowly began to relax again. Her laughter returned in small bursts, her drawings filled with color instead of dark lines. She still remembered everything, but the memory no longer controlled her. It became something she carried, not something that carried her. For Daniel, the experience reshaped his sense of leadership. He revised safety policies across all his properties, not just on paper, but in practice. He trained staff to listen more carefully, to take even small concerns seriously, to understand that danger didn't always come from obvious sources. Late one evening, standing alone in his apartment, Daniel looked out over the city and took a deep breath. The air filled his lungs easily, freely, and he didn't take it for granted anymore. He knew that somewhere out there was a little girl who had changed the course of his life simply by paying attention. And that knowledge stayed with him, steady and grounding, as he prepared to face whatever came next. As the investigation drew closer to its conclusion, the world around Daniel and Sophie slowly returned to a sense of order. The business center reopened under heightened security, and daily life resumed its familiar rhythm, though beneath the surface, things were no longer the same. Daniel walked through the building one afternoon, not as a rushed executive but as someone deliberately observing every detail, every face, every quiet corner where something might be overlooked. He stopped often, speaking with guards, maintenance workers, receptionists, asking questions he never would have asked before. Not out of suspicion, but out of respect. He had learned that awareness was not weakness, and listening was not a waste of time. Sophie, on the other hand, faced a different challenge. News of the incident had spread quietly through her school despite her efforts to keep it private. Whispers followed her in the hallways, curious glances lingered longer than before, and teachers treated her with a gentle caution that made her feel fragile. She didn't want to be known as the girl who stopped a bomb. She wanted to be known as herself. One afternoon, Daniel visited her school at her mother's invitation, not as a public figure, but as someone who owed a debt he intended to honor quietly. He spoke with the principal and teachers, explaining that Sophie needed space to return to normalcy, not attention or labels. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. The whispers faded, replaced by a respectful distance. After school, Daniel and Sophie sat on a bench in the playground while her mother spoke with a teacher nearby. Children laughed and ran around them, the sound light and carefree. Sophie watched them for a while before speaking. "Do you ever wish you hadn't known?" she asked suddenly. "About the bag?" Daniel considered the question carefully. Sometimes, he admitted. Knowing can be heavy. Then why is it still good that I said something, she asked. Daniel looked at her, really looked, and smiled softly. Because knowing gave you a choice. And you chose to protect people. Sophie nodded slowly, absorbing his words. That evening, Daniel returned home feeling a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The fear had faded, replaced by purpose. He understood now that leadership wasn't about control or authority, but about responsibility and humility. Sophie, in her own quiet way, had taught him that. Across the city, Sophie lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady sound of her mother moving around the apartment. The world felt safe again, not because danger no longer existed, but because she knew she could face it if it did. Both of them had been changed by the same moment. And both of them were stronger for it. Time softened the sharpest edges of what had happened, but it never erased the meaning of it. Months passed, and the business center became just another building again to most people, a place of meetings and schedules and passing conversations. For Daniel, however, it remained a quiet reminder of how close life had come to breaking, and how unexpectedly it had been protected. He changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. He no longer rushed through spaces with his mind elsewhere. He noticed people. He listened when someone hesitated before speaking. Small warnings, quiet concerns, instincts that once would have been brushed aside now held weight. His colleagues noticed the difference, even if they couldn't name it. Decisions were slower, more thoughtful, grounded not only in numbers but in human consequence. Sophie's life continued to grow outward again, returning to the rhythms of childhood. School projects, scraped knees, laughter that came easily and without fear. The memory of the black bag and the men's voices still existed, but it no longer defined her days. It had become a chapter in her life, not the whole story. She learned that being afraid didn't mean being weak, and that speaking up didn't mean you had to be loud. Daniel kept his promise. He supported Sophie's education, not as a grand gesture but as a quiet certainty. He stayed in touch, checking in from time to time, never turning her into a symbol or a headline. To him, she wasn't a miracle child or a hero for display. She was a person who had made a hard choice when it mattered. One evening, nearly a year after the incident, Daniel stood once more in the lobby where everything had begun. The column stood exactly where it always had. People passed by without a second glance. The space felt calm, ordinary, alive. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply, grateful for the simplicity of that act. Across the city, Sophie sat at her desk, carefully coloring a picture for school. It showed people holding hands, standing close together, safe. She didn't consciously think about why she chose that image. It just felt right. Neither of them would ever forget what had happened. But neither of them lived in fear of it anymore. Sometimes danger announces itself loudly. And sometimes it hides in plain sight. What mattered was that one small voice chose not to stay silent. And because of that, many lives continued forward, unchanged on the surface, but forever shaped beneath it.